Every rancher in Cedar Ridge feared one woman, the ruthless HOA president Karen Whitmore. She claimed my ranch violated community standards and gave me 7 days to leave land my family had owned for over a century. The sheriff even arrived with eviction papers. Most people would have surrendered. I drove to the county archives instead. Hidden beneath decades of dusty records was one document Karen prayed nobody would ever read. It wasn't my deed that was fake. It was the HOA's entire land grant. 3 weeks later, federal investigators surrounded Karen's office before sunrise, and everything she built collapsed. Cedar Ridge sat in the folded hills of Texas, a town where the creeks ran clear in spring and the oak trees had watched 4 generations of the same families ride past. Ethan Walker was 45 years old, a broad-shouldered man with a calm face and a habit of speaking only when he had something worth saying. He had grown up on 600 acres that his great-grandfather cleared with a mule and a stubborn will, and after his father passed away 2 years earlier, Ethan had left his desk job at the state comptroller's office, where he had spent nearly 2 decades auditing land records and rooting out fraud in county filings, and came home to run cattle again. People in town still called him the auditor, half in respect and half in memory of the quiet years he spent finding forged deeds and fake surveys before most folks even knew such things existed. Ethan had not planned to spend his life reading fine print buried in property filings. As a young man, he had wanted nothing more than to stay on the ranch permanently, but his father insisted he see something of the wider world first, reminding him that a rancher who understood the law could protect his own land far better than one who did not. So Ethan studied accounting at a university 2 hours east, then took a position with the state, expecting to stay only a few years. Instead, he found a quiet talent for the work, an eye that could spot a misplaced decimal or a forged signature the way other men could spot a storm building on the horizon. He built a career on patience, on reading the same document 3 times before trusting his own conclusion, on never accusing anyone of wrongdoing until the paper trail left no other honest explanation. That patience would matter more than he ever imagined once he came home for good. His father, Walter Walker, had run the ranch alone for the better part of 2 decades after Ethan's mother passed, refusing every offer to sell even as the hills around Cedar Ridge slowly filled with new construction and unfamiliar faces. Walter kept meticulous records of his own, ledgers going back generations, boundary surveys folded carefully into a cedar chest, correspondence with the county dating to a time when a handshake still meant something in a land dispute. When Walter died, the ranch passed to Ethan not just as property, but as a kind of unfinished conversation between father and son, one Ethan intended to honor by keeping the land exactly as his family always had, honest and unbothered by whatever grew up around its edges. The ranch itself was something out of an old photograph. Cattle grazed across rolling pasture that turned gold every autumn. A weathered windmill still turned near the eastern fence line, creaking the same tune it had creaked since before Ethan was born. Horses moved lazily around a low barn that his grandfather built by hand, and a spring-fed pond sat at the center of the property, reflecting the sky in the mornings when Ethan walked out with his coffee to check the fence lines. Neighbors waved when they passed his gate. Old-timers at the diner spoke of the Walker family the way people speak of a landmark, something permanent, something that belonged to the land as much as the land belonged to them. Every morning began the same way. Ethan rose before dawn, fed the horses, checked on the small herd of cattle grazing near the creek bed, and walked the fence line out of habit more than necessity, a ritual his father had taught him as a boy, and one he had never seen a reason to abandon. He knew every dip and rise of the property by feel, every place the fence sagged after a hard rain, every spot where deer liked to slip through the tree line at dusk. The work was slow and repetitive in a way that suited him after years spent buried in spreadsheets and filing cabinets, and more than once he had told friends back in Austin that trading a desk for a saddle was the best decision he had ever made, even if it meant giving up the steady-state paycheck that had once defined his adult life. The new development beyond his eastern fence had crept closer with each passing year, rows of identical houses replacing what had once been open scrubland, paved roads cutting through country that had never known anything but dirt and gravel. Ethan bore the change without much complaint, understanding that towns grew and people needed somewhere to live, so long as growth respected the boundaries that had stood honestly for generations. It was only when that growth began reaching past its own fence lines, hungry for land it had no legitimate claim to, that Ethan's patience finally found its limit. Karen Whitmore was a different kind of permanent. She had moved to Cedar Ridge 9 years earlier, bought a modest house at the edge of the new development called Ridgeline Estates, and within 18 months had installed herself as president of the Homeowners Association. She wore white blazers even in the heat, carried a clipboard like a badge of office, and spoke constantly of protecting community standards and property values, though nobody could quite remember voting her into a position with so much reach. Under Karen, the HOA had grown from a modest group overseeing shared fences and mailbox paint colors into something closer to a shadow government, one that fined people for the height of their grass and threatened liens against families who fell behind on dues. Nobody in town knew much about where Karen had come from before Cedar Ridge, only that she arrived with confidence far exceeding her modest new house, and money that seemed to appear whenever the association needed it most. She spoke often of a background in property management somewhere out west, though she was careful never to name a specific company or a specific city, deflecting any question with a practiced laugh and a quick change of subject. Within her first year on the board, she pushed out the association's original elderly president, an easygoing widower who had run things loosely for a decade, replacing him through a rushed vote most residents barely noticed until it was already finished. From there, Karen expanded her authority steadily and deliberately, adding new bylaws almost every season, each one granting the board slightly more power over what residents could build, plant, or park on their own property. She hired an attorney on retainer, funded through dues residents assumed were paying for shared landscaping, and began sending fines with a frequency that made even minor infractions feel like personal attacks. Longtime residents whispered that crossing Karen meant inviting a slow, grinding campaign of paperwork and pressure that rarely ended well for the homeowner on the receiving end. Most people simply paid whatever she asked rather than risk finding out how far she was willing to go, which was precisely the reputation she seemed determined to cultivate. One crisp October morning, Karen arrived at Ethan's gate with 3 inspectors trailing behind her, clipboards in hand, cameras raised toward the barn and the fence line as if gathering evidence for a trial. She told Ethan that his ranch was dragging down surrounding property values, that the smell of livestock and the sight of aging equipment offended the aesthetic standards of the new neighborhood growing up around his boundary. Ethan reminded her, evenly, that his family had worked this land for over 100 years, long before Ridgeline Estates existed, long before Karen Whitmore had ever set foot in Cedar Ridge. Karen smiled the thin smile of someone who had already decided how the conversation would end, and began handing him a stack of violation notices right there at the gate. By the time she climbed back into her white pickup truck, Karen had left behind fines for unpermitted structures, notices demanding the horse barn be relocated, and a formal warning about what she called excessive agricultural odor. She paused before driving off, rolled down her window, and told him this would be the last autumn he ever spent on that land. Ethan said nothing. He simply watched her taillights disappear down the gravel road, and felt, for the first time since coming home, a cold and unfamiliar unease settle into his chest. The following week brought an avalanche of paperwork. Karen's office mailed formal fines, cease and desist letters, and a crown of demands, including an order to tear down the horse barn and remove nearly a mile of perimeter fencing that had stood since the 1950s. Then came the letter that changed everything. The Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, it announced, held legal authority over a significant portion of Ethan's property under something called a community land grant, a document that supposedly predated even his family's original deed. Karen appeared at his door personally to deliver a copy, a document stamped with a red seal and dense legal language, claiming that a large parcel of the Walker Ranch had, decades ago, been designated common land under association control. She stood on his porch with her arms crossed, informing him that the sheriff would be along shortly to formalize the transition. Ethan studied the document carefully as she spoke, noting the language, the formatting, and something in the phrasing that struck him as oddly modern for a supposedly 19th century filing, though he kept that observation to himself for the moment, unwilling to tip his hand before he had a chance to verify it properly. True to her word, within 2 days, a sheriff's deputy arrived at Ethan's gate carrying enforcement papers, apologetic but firm, explaining that the county had received a filing that required him to serve notice regardless of his own personal opinion about the matter. The deputy, a younger man named Cole Ramirez, who had grown up 2 properties down from the Walker Ranch and remembered riding horses with Ethan as a boy, seemed genuinely uncomfortable standing at the gate with papers, meant to remove a family he had known his entire life. He told Ethan quietly, almost apologetically, that the filing had come through properly stamped and notarized, and that his hands were tied until a court said otherwise, a remark that stuck with Ethan far longer than the deputy likely intended. Word spread through Cedar Ridge fast. Neighbors stopped by with worried faces, urging Ethan to simply sell before things got worse, warning him that nobody had ever beaten Karen Whitmore in a dispute, that families who fought her lost more than they ever imagined. An older rancher named Pete Callahan, who had lost nearly 40 acres to the association 2 years earlier under similar pressure, sat on Ethan's porch one evening and told him plainly that fighting Karen only delayed the inevitable, that she always found a way to win because she controlled the paperwork, and the paperwork controlled everything. Ethan listened patiently, refilling Pete's coffee twice, but something about the story nagged at him long after Pete drove away that night. The pressure kept mounting through the following days. A lien notice appeared taped to Ethan's mailbox, threatening to attach itself to the deed if outstanding fines were not paid within 10 days. A separate letter arrived from Karen's retained attorney, citing obscure clauses in the so-called community land grant and demanding immediate compliance with the barn relocation order. Even the local feed store owner mentioned, almost apologetically, that Karen had stopped by asking questions about Ethan's account, as though building a picture of his finances before the fight had even properly begun. Ethan recognized the pattern immediately from his years auditing fraud cases for the state. A slow tightening of pressure meant to exhaust a target into surrender long before any court ever had to get involved. Ethan listened to every warning politely, thanked each neighbor for their concern, and asked only one question in return, a question that made Karen's confident expression falter for just a moment when he asked it directly to her face during a chance encounter outside the county courthouse. He asked where the original land grant document was kept, the true original, not a photocopy with a red stamp on it. Karen told him it was archived securely at the county courthouse. Though her voice carried a flicker of hesitation, she quickly covered with irritation. Ethan simply nodded, thanked her, and got into his truck. He did not go home. He drove straight toward the county archives building downtown, a squat limestone structure that had stood since the 1920s, home to more than a century of deeds, grants, and survey records. If there truly was an original document proving the HOA's claim, he intended to find it himself and read every word of it with his own trained eyes. The archives smelled of old paper and dust, a scent Ethan remembered fondly from his years working land disputes for the state. Behind the front counter sat an elderly clerk named Harold Simmons, a man who had worked in that building for nearly 40 years and remembered Ethan's father well, recalling how the elder Walker used to bring him fresh eggs from the ranch every spring in exchange for help finding old survey maps. Harold's face lit with recognition when Ethan explained what he needed, and without hesitation, he led him back into the deep archive stacks where records older than a century sat in acid-free boxes, untouched for decades. Ethan spent the entire afternoon pulling files, cross-referencing plat maps, deed transfers, and survey records dating back over 120 years. His training as an auditor kicked in immediately, an old instinct returning like muscle memory. He knew how to read the subtle signs of authenticity in a document, the particular grain of period-correct paper, the consistency of ink oxidation, the placement and pressure of a county seal. What he found stunned him. The original 19th century survey maps showed no trace of any land grant to a homeowners association. In fact, no homeowners association existed anywhere in county records until decades later. Whatever legal foundation Karen claimed to be standing on simply was not there in the historical record, not in any form Ethan could locate. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan pulled thread after thread, laying survey maps side by side across a long reading table, tracing boundary lines with a magnifying glass he had carried in his truck since his auditing days out of habit rather than expectation. Harold brought him coffee twice, and sat nearby telling old stories about Walter Walker. About the winter, Ethan's father had walked 3 miles through snow just to make sure a boundary dispute between 2 neighboring families got settled honestly before it turned ugly. Ethan smiled at the memories, even as his focus stayed fixed on the documents, cross-checking archive index numbers against a master ledger Harold kept behind the counter, a ledger that had not been fully digitized and therefore had never been altered the way electronic records so easily could be. Near closing time, as Harold helped him pull one final box related to land transfers from the early 2000s, Ethan noticed something troubling. A folder that should have contained the original 1920 survey plat, cross-referenced in the archive's own index, was missing entirely. In its place sat a newer folder with slightly mismatched labeling containing photocopies rather than originals. Someone had been in these records before him. Someone had removed something and replaced it with something else. Sometime around 2008, the same year, Ethan now recalled, that Ridgeline Estates broke ground, and the Homeowners Association was first formally registered with the county. Ethan drove home that night with his headlights cutting through the dark hill country roads, his mind working the way it used to work during his best audits, when a case first cracked open and the pieces started arranging themselves into a shape he could recognize. He knew now that this was not simply a property dispute. Someone had built the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association's entire legal authority on a foundation that did not exist in the historical record, and someone had gone to considerable trouble to make sure nobody ever noticed. Over the following days, Ethan requested certified copies of every document connected to the disputed land grant, comparing them line by line with the assistance of Harold, who quietly pulled additional boxes after hours out of loyalty to the Walker family. Ethan laid the documents across his kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle, examining file numbers, archive codes, notarization stamps, and plat references. What emerged was a portrait of forgery stitched together with surprising cleverness, yet full of small inconsistencies that only a trained eye would catch. The so-called community land grant appeared to have been assembled from 3 separate documents: an old survey border borrowed from a completely different section of the county, a notary seal pattern that did not match any registered notary from the claimed decade, and language patterns lifted, almost word for word, from a modern template used in association filings after the year 2000. The dates simply did not align. A grant supposedly issued in the 1890s referenced legal terminology that did not exist in Texas property law until decades later. The ink, when Ethan examined the original filed with the county under a magnifying lamp borrowed from Harold's office, showed the telltale sheen of a modern laser printer rather than the iron gall ink common to genuine documents of that era. Someone had built a convincing fake, convincing enough to fool sheriffs and neighbors and casual observers, but not convincing enough to survive an actual audit conducted by someone who knew precisely what to look for. When Karen caught wind that Ethan had been requesting records from the archives, she moved quickly. She contacted the county clerk's office directly, requesting that certain historical files be sealed pending what she called an internal association review, citing concerns about tampering. Harold called Ethan the moment he heard about the request, warning him that access might be cut off within days. Fortunately, Ethan had already spent 2 full nights photographing and scanning every relevant document, storing digital copies safely on an encrypted drive, along with detailed notes cross-referencing every inconsistency he uncovered. Whatever Karen tried to hide now, Ethan already held the evidence in his hands. Then, late one night, as Ethan sat at his kitchen table organizing his findings, a knock came at his door. Standing on the porch in the moonlight was a thin, nervous woman he did not immediately recognize, though something about her face seemed familiar from town. She introduced herself as Diane Foster, explaining in a hushed and hurried voice that she had worked as the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association's bookkeeper for 6 years, before quitting quietly the previous spring, unable to stomach what she had witnessed happening behind closed doors. Diane told Ethan everything that night, seated at his kitchen table with trembling hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she barely touched. She explained that she had taken the bookkeeping job for the association, believing it would be simple work, tracking dues and paying vendors for landscaping and shared amenities, the kind of quiet administrative role she had performed for other small organizations for years without incident. Within her first few months, though, she noticed payments routed to vendors she could not identify, invoices marked only with vague descriptions, and instructions from Karen to keep certain transactions out of the standard quarterly reports shared with the board. Karen, she explained, had spent years building a scheme far larger than anyone in Cedar Ridge realized. She had altered survey records, replaced original archive documents with fabricated substitutes, and paid a document specialist under the table to produce convincing forgeries designed to withstand casual scrutiny. Diane described the night she first suspected something was deeply wrong, when she noticed a payment described only as archival consulting, sent to an address that turned out to belong to a print and copy shop rather than any legitimate historical service. When she quietly asked Karen about the payment, Karen's response had been sharp and immediate, warning her never to question the board's financial decisions again if she wanted to keep her position. Several other ranching families in the surrounding hills had already been pressured into selling portions of their land under similar threats, families too frightened or too exhausted to fight back the way Ethan intended to. Diane named 3 of them quietly, families Ethan recognized immediately, people who had simply vanished from the county rolls over the past several years without much explanation beyond quiet rumors that they had grown tired of ranch life and moved on. Hearing their names now, in this new and terrible context, Ethan felt a heavy weight settle over him, understanding for the first time just how many lives Karen's scheme had already quietly ruined before he ever received his first violation notice. Before leaving that night, Diane handed Ethan a small flash drive containing years of internal financial records, emails between Karen and a shadowy consulting firm, and invoices for services described only as document preparation and archival consulting. The numbers were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled out of homeowners association dues over the years, money that residents believed was paying for landscaping and community events, but had instead financed an elaborate campaign to seize land under false legal pretenses. As Diane climbed into her car to leave, she mentioned one more detail, almost as an afterthought: the name of the company that had allegedly produced the forged land grant documents, a small outfit operating out of a strip mall 2 counties over that Ethan had never heard of, but intended to investigate immediately. Armed with Diane's records and his own archival findings, Ethan began building a formal audit, the kind of methodical, page-by-page accounting he had once performed for the state of Texas. He created spreadsheets tracking every dollar the Homeowners Association had collected and spent over the previous 8 years, cross-referencing legal fees, lobbying expenditures, and unexplained payments to the document company Diane had named. The pattern that emerged was damning. Association dues, meant for community upkeep, had been systematically diverted toward what internal memos euphemistically called land acquisition support, a phrase that, once Ethan understood its true meaning, made his stomach turn. He reached out to a young attorney in town named Rebecca Hale, who had recently opened her own practice after years working land disputes in Austin. Rebecca listened to Ethan's evidence with growing disbelief, then agreed almost immediately to take the case, waiving her usual retainer once she understood the scale of what Ethan had uncovered and what it might mean for the dozens of other families quietly suffering under Karen's reign. Rebecca spent an entire weekend at Ethan's kitchen table helping him organize the evidence into a form a court could actually use, translating his auditor's spreadsheets and archival notes into a clear legal narrative supported by exhibits and sworn declarations. She flagged which pieces of evidence carried the most weight, which required additional corroboration, and which could wait until discovery forced Karen's attorneys to produce records voluntarily. Ethan found himself impressed by her thoroughness, and Rebecca in turn admitted she had never worked a case where the plaintiff arrived not just with a grievance, but with an evidence file more organized than most law enforcement agencies could produce on their own. Together they filed a formal legal challenge against the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, demanding the land grant be declared invalid and requesting an independent audit of association finances. The filing also requested emergency injunctive relief, asking the court to freeze any further enforcement action against Ethan's property while the matter proceeded, a request Judge Alvarez granted within days after reviewing the initial evidence Rebecca submitted. For the first time since Karen's white pickup truck had rolled up to his gate, Ethan felt the ground beneath him grow steady again. When word of the lawsuit reached Karen, she reacted with open contempt, telling anyone who would listen that Ethan Walker was a bitter rancher trying to avoid legitimate community obligations and that his lawsuit would collapse the moment it reached a courtroom. She hired an aggressive law firm from Austin, confident that her resources and her carefully constructed paper trail would crush any challenge before it gained momentum. She laughed when a mutual acquaintance told her Ethan had hired a small-town attorney with no courtroom experience against association matters. She believed, with the same certainty that had carried her through 9 years of unchecked authority, that Ethan Walker did not stand a chance. But the presiding judge, a measured and exacting woman named Judge Patricia Alvarez, was not interested in confidence or reputation. During the preliminary hearing, she ordered both sides to produce original documentation supporting their claims, specifically instructing the Homeowners Association to present the original community land grant, not a certified copy, but the physical original document itself, along with a full chain of custody explaining where it had been stored for the past century. The courtroom on the day of the hearing was packed beyond capacity, filled with ranching families, curious townsfolk, and reporters from the regional paper who had caught wind that something unusual was unfolding in Cedar Ridge. Karen arrived flanked by her attorneys, dressed in her signature white blazer, carrying herself with the practiced confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. Her legal team presented photocopies, expert witnesses paid to vouch for the document's authenticity, and a smooth, well-rehearsed narrative about historical land use dating back generations. Then it was Ethan's turn. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform for the room. He simply walked the court through his findings with the same methodical calm he had once used auditing fraud cases for the state of Texas. He pointed to the mismatched notary seal pattern, comparing it side by side with genuine seals from the same claimed decade. He explained the modern ink composition revealed under magnification, contrasting it against period-correct documents pulled from the same archive box. He walked the judge through the borrowed survey lines, showing precisely which unrelated county file they had been lifted from, and laid out the timeline discrepancies in the legal terminology used throughout the supposed 19th century grant. Karen's attorney attempted to interrupt several times, objecting to the relevance of what he called minor technical quibbles. But Judge Alvarez waved him down each time, telling him plainly that in matters of property fraud, technical details were rarely minor. Ethan continued undeterred, pulling up enlarged photographs of the paper fibers under raking light, showing the court how genuine aged paper degraded differently than paper artificially treated to appear old. He explained, in plain language any juror could follow, how a forger might soak paper in tea or coffee to mimic age, but could never replicate the natural chemical breakdown that occurred in true 19th century cotton rag paper over a full century of storage. Several jurors leaned forward in their seats, and even Karen's own attorneys began exchanging uneasy glances across their table. Rebecca Hale followed Ethan's testimony with a series of pointed questions for Karen herself, forcing her to explain, under oath, exactly how the association had come into possession of a land grant that appeared nowhere in the county's own historical index. Karen's answers grew increasingly evasive, her earlier confidence visibly draining as she struggled to explain gaps that grew wider with every question. She claimed the document had been found in a private family collection donated to the association years earlier, but when Rebecca asked for the name of the donor, Karen hesitated long enough for the entire courtroom to draw its own conclusion. A forensic document examiner, brought in independently by Rebecca and paid for through a fund, quietly organized by other ranching families who had heard what Ethan discovered, confirmed every one of his findings under oath. The so-called community land grant, the examiner testified, was not an authentic historical document. It had been assembled and physically aged sometime within the past 2 decades, using techniques common to modern document forgery. A hush fell across the courtroom. Karen's confident expression cracked for the first time, her eyes darting toward her attorneys, who suddenly seemed far less certain of their earlier bravado. Judge Alvarez did not rule immediately. Instead, she looked directly at Karen and ordered a full criminal investigation into the origins of the document, along with the association's financial records, effective immediately. Sheriff's deputies moved through the courtroom gallery toward the exits, and within the hour, a search warrant had been issued for the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association's offices, sending a wave of hushed, disbelieving conversation rippling through the crowd that had gathered to watch what many now realized was the unraveling of something much larger than a single property dispute. The following morning, investigators arrived at the association's small brick office building before most of Cedar Ridge had finished breakfast. Computers were seized, filing cabinets emptied into evidence boxes, and Karen herself was seen being escorted out under the watchful eyes of neighbors who had once feared crossing her, now simply staring in stunned silence. Reports later surfaced that Karen had attempted, in the panicked hours after the hearing, to destroy several boxes of records in a barrel behind the association office, only to be stopped by a deputy who arrived just in time to preserve what remained as evidence. In the days that followed, more residents came forward, encouraged by Diane's courage and emboldened by the sight of Karen's empire crumbling in real time. Families who had quietly sold portions of their land years earlier under similar threats began sharing their stories, revealing a pattern of intimidation, forged paperwork, and financial manipulation that stretched back nearly a decade. Local news vans began appearing along the main road into town, and what had started as a single rancher's fight against an overreaching HOA quickly became a story followed across the entire region, drawing attention from state regulators and land fraud investigators who specialized in exactly this kind of scheme. Within 2 weeks, agents from a federal land fraud task force arrived in Cedar Ridge, working alongside state investigators to trace the full scope of Karen's operation. It turned out her scheme extended beyond the borders of Cedar Ridge entirely, connected to a small network of shell companies and a document forger who had quietly assisted similar HOA power grabs in 2 neighboring counties. Federal agents surrounded the association's satellite office before sunrise on a cold November morning, executing warrants that would eventually lead to formal charges against Karen and 2 of her closest associates, including the very document specialist Diane had named that first night on Ethan's porch. Investigators discovered that Karen's scheme followed a consistent pattern across every county where she had operated. She would identify a property owner sitting on land the developing community wanted, often older ranching families with valuable acreage but limited resources to fight a prolonged legal battle. She would then manufacture a plausible historical claim, using genuine period-correct materials sourced from estate sales and antique paper dealers, aged and stamped by her hired specialist until the forgeries could pass a cursory inspection by anyone who did not know precisely what to look for. Most targets, faced with official-looking documents and the threat of a sheriff at their door, simply gave up and sold at a fraction of fair value, never suspecting that the entire legal foundation of their eviction had been manufactured in a strip mall print shop 2 counties away. Local news vans multiplied along the road into town as the story grew, and reporters from as far as the state capitol arrived to cover what had quickly become one of the largest homeowners association fraud cases the region had ever seen. Karen's mugshot appeared on every regional broadcast within days, the white blazer replaced by a plain jail uniform that seemed to strip away every ounce of authority she had once projected so effortlessly. Residents of Ridgeline Estates who had once feared crossing her now spoke openly to reporters, describing years of intimidation and unexplained fines that suddenly made a great deal more sense in light of what investigators were uncovering. The legal proceedings that followed moved with unusual speed, driven by the overwhelming weight of evidence Ethan and Rebecca had assembled. Judge Alvarez formally declared the community land grant null and void, along with every enforcement action the Homeowners Association had taken under its false authority. All fines against Ethan were dismissed. The demand to tear down his barn and fencing was permanently vacated. Karen Whitmore was indicted on multiple counts of document fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, facing the very real possibility of years behind bars for what prosecutors described as one of the most brazen land fraud schemes the county had seen in decades. The Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association itself was dissolved by court order shortly after, its remaining assets distributed toward legal restitution for the families it had wronged. Several ranching families who had sold land under duress in previous years filed their own claims once the fraud became public record, and many eventually recovered portions of what they had lost, either through settlement or through negotiated buybacks funded by the seized association assets. Rebecca took on 3 of these cases pro bono in the weeks that followed, using the precedent set by Ethan's ruling to move each one through the courts far faster than would otherwise have been possible. A small office in downtown Cedar Ridge, suddenly becoming the center of a quiet, methodical reckoning for years of buried harm. Deputy Cole Ramirez, the young officer who had once delivered enforcement papers to Ethan's gate, returned to the ranch weeks later under very different circumstances, removing his hat as he walked up the porch steps to offer a quiet, sincere apology for the role he had unknowingly played in the ordeal. He explained that he had requested a transfer away from any future association-related enforcement, telling Ethan he never wanted to stand at another family's gate holding papers built on a lie. Ethan shook his hand without bitterness. He understood the deputy had simply been doing his job with the information he had been given at the time, and told him plainly that there was no need to carry guilt over decisions made in good faith. Cedar Ridge held an impromptu gathering out on Ethan's pasture that following weekend, neighbors bringing folding chairs and covered dishes, children running between the horse barn and the pond while the adults spoke in relieved, disbelieving tones about everything that had finally come undone. Diane Foster attended, greeted warmly by families who understood the risk she had taken coming forward. Harold Simmons drove out from the archives building, proudly telling anyone who would listen that he always knew a Walker would eventually set the record straight, just as Ethan's father had done decades earlier, in smaller, quieter ways around the county. Pete Callahan came too, standing quietly near the fence for most of the afternoon before finally approaching Ethan with an apology he clearly had been rehearsing since the news broke. He admitted he had given up too easily when the association came for his own land, and that watching Ethan refuse to do the same had reminded him of a kind of stubbornness he thought had disappeared from Cedar Ridge, along with the previous generation. Ethan told him there was nothing to apologize for, that most people made the same reasonable calculation when facing an opponent who seemed to control every lever of power, and that the only difference in his own case had been years spent learning exactly how those levers worked. Pete shook his hand for a long moment, then finally allowed himself a small, relieved smile, the first Ethan had seen from him since the whole ordeal began. As the gathering wound down and the sky deepened into the soft orange of early evening, Rebecca Hale pulled Ethan aside near the barn to share news that had just reached her from the district attorney's office. Investigators had confirmed that the document company Diane named was responsible for at least 6 similar forged land grants across 2 neighboring counties, meaning Ethan's audit had not only saved his own ranch, but had likely spared several other families from suffering the same fate in the months ahead. Ethan absorbed the news quietly, feeling less triumphant than simply grateful that the pattern had finally been broken before it could spread any further through the hill country he had known his entire life. That evening, after the last of the neighbors had driven off down the gravel road and the sun had dropped low behind the hills, Ethan walked into the old ranch house and pulled a heavy iron box down from the top shelf of his father's closet, a box he had not opened since the funeral 2 years earlier. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilskin, he found his father's handwritten journal, a set of original survey maps far older than anything Karen had ever forged, and a bundle of letters written by his great-grandfather nearly a century earlier. Reading late into the night at the kitchen table, Ethan discovered that his father had long suspected something was wrong with the growing development encroaching on Cedar Ridge, noting in careful handwriting his concerns about unfamiliar surveyors walking the property line back in the early 2000s, years before the Homeowners Association ever filed its false claim. Walter had written of confronting one such surveyor directly, a man who gave a false name and drove away before Walter could ask any further questions. An encounter he recorded with the same careful precision Ethan now recognized in his own instincts, as though the habit of watching for trouble on the land had passed quietly from father to son, long before either of them understood why it mattered. His great-grandfather's letters described helping establish the earliest roads and boundaries of the town itself, working alongside county officials to ensure the land records remained honest for future generations, a quiet legacy. Ethan now understood he had unknowingly continued, simply by refusing to hand over his gate keys without asking one simple question first. One letter in particular, written to a cousin back east, described the elder Walker's belief that land records were the truest form of memory a community could keep, more honest than any story passed down by word of mouth, because paper, properly kept, could not change its account with time the way memory so often did. Ethan read that line 3 times before setting the letter down, understanding for the first time that his own instinct to trust the archive over Karen's confident claims had roots reaching back over a century. In the weeks that followed, Ethan donated the entire collection, his father's journal, the original survey maps, and his great-grandfather's letters, to the County Historical Museum, along with copies of the audit findings that had exposed Karen's scheme. The county formally recognized the Walker property as a historic family ranch, placing a modest bronze marker near the front gate that told visitors the land had remained in continuous family ownership for over a century, a fact that no forged document had ever managed to erase. On a clear morning not long after, with frost still clinging to the pasture grass and the windmill turning slowly in the early light, Ethan saddled his horse and rode out across the fields his family had protected for generations. He passed the bronze marker near the front gate, its lettering still bright and unweathered, and thought briefly of how strange it was that a single afternoon in a dusty archive had unraveled something built so carefully over nearly a decade. He thought of his father, of Harold's dusty archive stacks, of Diane's trembling hands wrapped around that untouched cup of coffee, and of the simple truth that had guided him through every step of the ordeal. Word eventually reached Ethan that Karen had accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial on the full weight of federal charges, and would spend several years in prison followed by a lengthy period of supervised release, with restitution ordered for every family the association had wronged. He felt no satisfaction in the news, only a quiet sense that the record had finally been set right, which had always mattered more to him than any measure of personal vindication. Ridgeline Estates elected a new, far more modest association board in the months that followed, one that spent its first meeting simply apologizing to the wider community and pledging never again to overstep the boundaries the law actually allowed. Records, when kept honestly, always tell the truth eventually, no matter how long someone works to bury it. Sitting tall in the saddle as the sun rose fully over Cedar Ridge, Ethan understood that his family's legacy was no longer just a matter of pride. It was proof, carved into paper and ink and land, that the truth outlasts every lie built to replace it, and that a single honest record, kept safe long enough, could still undo even the most carefully constructed deception.